Humility is the noble choice to forego your status, deploy your resources, or use your influence for the good of others before yourself. Humility does not mean we are doormats for others. Humility does not mean we are milquetoasts, afraid to use our power for justice. Humility does mean that we have, as human beings made in the image of God, the innate dignity and power to serve others for the common good.
You're listening to the Faith and Work Podcast, where we explore ways to serve God and others in our daily work to bring life and hope to workplaces and cities.
Welcome to the Faith and Work Podcast, a podcast of Denver Institute for Faith and Work. My name is Ross Chapman. I serve as the CEO at Denver Institute. Excited to share a new episode with you today. It was a recording from a conference we host called Business for the Common Good. We've been doing it for 9 years, and it's really about getting Christians who are in business to have the opportunity to come together and learn, and also just get to know each other better and ask the same kind of questions about what does it mean to be a Christian in business? What kind of opportunities do I have to join with what God's doing in my city, in my workplace, in the world, through my everyday work? And we actually think business is a unique driver of human flourishing, probably unlike any other kind of engine we have in society. So it's a great conference, and we're really excited to host our 10th one this coming March 2026. So Dr. Uli Chi opened up our day with a talk called The Wise Leader. He also wrote a book called The Wise Leader, and he's become a friend of Denver Institute. And it was an inspiring talk. It was full of rich insights. And in a season of life and in a time in society where we are completely inundated with artificial intelligence, the age of information, one of the things we want most that is so hard to find and to actually recognize even is wisdom. And so what does it mean to be a leader and a worker and a Christian who is thinking about how do I let wisdom be more prevalent in my life? How do I cultivate it in my life? How do I lead with wisdom? And how do I let that wisdom serve God and others around me as we pursue the common good together? So I hope that you enjoy this talk from Uli Chi. Listen closely and you'll learn.
So I want to tell you a little bit about myself and my own story and talk a little bit about how we might become formed as wise leaders. You know, I still remember the evening sitting in a car with my wife, Gail. We had just finished dinner at one of our local restaurants, and it was a dreary, rainy, Seattle kind of day. That's where I'm from. I could tell she was wrestling with some things she wanted to say, so we sat there for a long time in silence. Finally, she turned to me and she said, "I can't do this anymore. Something has to change or we won't make it together." By that time, we'd been together for 10 years. Gail and I met and started dating when we were at university together. She was a terrific artist and interior designer. I was a math and computer science geek. I came from a high-achieving immigrant family. You might know some folks like that. And I always did well in school. But you could tell when Gail and I started to fall in love because my GPA dropped through the floor. She and I married as undergrads. She assumed a supporting role while I finished my education and started my professional career. But she and I were both sort of type A driven people. We had high expectations of ourselves, of each other, and of our families. And we were deeply committed to following Jesus. A young family quickly followed, as did leadership opportunities, both at work and at church. I started managing a team of technologists, and at the same time became the first-time elder at our local church. And at the same time, we had started a new family, and I tried to be a loving spouse. To top it off, my company offered me a chance to start my PhD work in computer science while I was working full-time. Pretty crazy and over the top, wouldn't you say? But maybe you can relate to that story because we all live in a leadership culture that expects us to do it all. We struggle with expectations that are placed on us and sometimes those that we place on ourselves at home, at church, at work, in our civic life. And our Christian commitments, if we're not careful, can make it worse. because we want to do great and good things for God, right? You all are here this morning, after all, because you are committed to the flourishing of your businesses, of your nonprofits, of your church, and you want to see the flourishing of this city of Denver. And those are great and wonderful expectations. But how we do those things matters a lot. If we don't handle them well, we ourselves, as Gail and I did, become overwhelmed by expectations. We have frayed relationships, missed family commitments, and work that never seems to end. In retrospect, I was foolish to take on so many responsibilities at once. My sense of calling to all of them made it hard for me to say no to any of them. But by God's grace and with considerable patience from Gail, we made some hard decisions and I cut back on some of my commitments. Fast forward to today, and I'm glad to tell you that Gail and I are celebrating our 50th wedding anniversary this year. And thanks be to God, right? None of us makes this on our own. And the good news is, for all of us, and for me, is that wisdom can be learned, right? Even if it requires getting some sense knocked into us along the way. Exhibit A, right here. What forms us? What forms wisdom in us as leaders? That's the question I want to explore with you this morning. As you might expect, the answer to that question is complicated, as are most questions about wisdom. But knowing some key themes along the way can help. I want to talk about 3 themes with you this morning related to becoming a wise leader. Being a servant leader, being a human leader, and being a communal leader. I suspect most of us who are in this room want to be servant leaders, right? After all, our vocation as leaders is not, in Jesus' words, to lord it over others, but to serve them instead. And yet, being a leader by definition means we have power over others. And that's true whether that power energizes you, as it does some, or makes you nervous, as it does others. In my first management role, I became friends with a fellow manager named Pete. Pete was a little bit older than I was, a little bit more experienced. We used to swap stories about what it meant to become a leader who was following Jesus. One day, Pete startled me by saying, it's not hard to be a leader if you don't mind being a son of a bitch. Pete's memorable words reminded me of how hard it is to hold humility and power together. You can have one or the other, but they really don't mix well. But learning to see power and humility as 2 sides of the same coin, rather than as opposing and incompatible ways of being a leader, has been an important part of forming wisdom in me as a leader. So what are some helpful insights along the way? To begin with, it's worth noting that Jesus' teaching on humility is rooted in his authority and power. As Jesus finished washing Peter's feet, he said, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet." Jesus embodies a radical posture of humility. At the very same time, he reaffirms his authority and power as Lord and teacher. That's challenging for us to do. I currently teach at Fuller Seminary's Doctorate of Global Leadership program, and the program is quite distinctive because of the diversity of its participants. Several are Black women who hold senior executive and management roles in large public corporations. I quickly learned that talking about leaders being servants landed for them quite differently than it did for me. For them, quote, being servants sounded disturbingly like the cultural message that Black women are supposed to serve and not lead. It's important to remember that Jesus didn't wash Peter's feet because Jesus was a household servant. Indeed, exactly the opposite, right? Jesus, as God incarnate, wielded his power by kneeling to do the work of the lowliest servant for the sake of others. That's what made it so startling. I find historian John Dixon's definition of humility helpful. He defines humility as, quote, the noble choice to forego your status, deploy your resources, or use your influence for the good of others before yourself. Let me say that again. Humility is the noble choice to forego your status, deploy your resources, or use your influence for the good of others before yourself. Humility does not mean we are doormats for others. Humility does not mean we are milquetoasts, afraid to use our power for justice. Humility does mean that we have, as human beings made in the image of God, the innate dignity and power to serve others for the common good. So one of the first lessons of becoming a wise leader is to learn how to exercise power and humility together to serve others. But while we're doing that, it's important to also remember who your real master is. Jesus calls us to serve others because we are, first and foremost, his servants. As leaders committed to serving others, we face needs that, left unchecked, seek to master us. In an always-on, interconnected world that we all live in, everyone's needs stare us in the face 24/7. I was raised in a family system that expected me to care about others, and that's a good thing. Having been trained to care has been a good thing for me as a leader. After all, learning to care is one of the great gifts of a Christian vision of being human. But paradoxically, we also need to learn as leaders not to care. Now that may be surprising. Our wisest spiritual guides tell us that it's important to cultivate a healthy detachment. If we care too much, we risk being overwhelmed and burning out. Remembering that Jesus is our master helps us to learn that not everything is our responsibility. Not every need is ours to meet. Not every burden is ours to carry. In the words of the poet T.S. Eliot, teach us to care and not to care. Otherwise, the needs of others will master us. Learning to discern when to care and when not to care is a journey of wisdom. That's why Eliot expressed it as a prayer. Wisdom is formed in us as leaders as we learn to pray, teach us to care and not to care. And as we learn when and how to care, we discover something surprising. Leaders have to learn to pay attention to the periphery of our vision. As leaders, we naturally focus on those people who are most important to our work. As board chair of a large regional health system, I spend a lot of time with my CEO, with my board members, and with the executive colleagues of my CEO. That's central to my work of being an effective leader as a board chair and as a servant of the missions of the organization's mission. But one of the radical challenges of a Christian vision of leadership is that we must also pay attention to those on the periphery. We need to focus not only on those we consider important and influential for our work, but also those who are on the margins. One way I do this is by regularly visiting our frontline workers, something we call rounding in healthcare. Our managers do it, our executives do it, and as board chair, it's essential for me to do it. It's a chance to see and learn about things firsthand. And it's a great way to honor those who are doing the essential but often unrecognized work of taking care of our patients. The truth is, as leaders, we naturally focus on what we deem most important. Becoming wise requires us to pay attention not only to the center of our vision, but also to what is on the periphery. These are some helpful insights around how we might wisely imagine what it means to be a servant and a leader.
Hey, I'm Luke.
And I'm Samantha.
And we're donors to Denver Institute for Faith and Work.
As entrepreneurs, our work can often feel all-consuming. The Denver Institute for Faith and Work has helped us to think both critically and theologically about how our business is impacting our workers and the communities we are a part of.
As Denver Institute pursues its mission to prepare people to serve God and others through their daily work, we look forward to the impact it'll have. This can't happen without the support of this community. If you've been encouraged by this conversation, or if your life has been shaped by Denver Institute, we encourage you to join us in giving to this mission.
To learn more or to make a financial gift, please visit the Give page at denverinstitute.org.
The second theme I want to explore with you is embracing a human rather than a superhuman model of leadership. One of the astonishing claims of the Christian faith that we all hold is that the God who created the heavens and the earth, all things visible and invisible, became a human being in Jesus of Nazareth. How extraordinary that the creator of the universe willingly embraced the limits and the limitations of being human. In some ways, Jesus' humanity is more difficult for us to grasp than his divinity. We like to think of him as Superman. He may look like Clark Kent, He may act like Clark Kent, but we all know he's Superman. Jesus may look human, and he may even act human, but we know that he's really God incarnate, right? And therefore can't really be human. But as hard as it is for us to fathom, and it's been hard over the ages of the church, the truth of Jesus' full humanity can help form us as a wise leader. And here's why. If Jesus accepted the limitations of being human, so should we. Wise leaders aren't superheroes. To put it in more familiar biblical language, wise leaders don't strive to become, quote, like God. Rather, wise leaders recognize their humanity and embrace their finiteness. As someone once said, there is a God, but you're not it. As a tech entrepreneur, I know the long hours and hard work it takes to start a new business. I've also seen the positive effect a thriving business can have on people and communities, locally and nationally. But success, whether in business, church, or nonprofits, can create the illusion that we are godlike, that we can or should work nonstop. That's particularly true in entrepreneurial settings. As Harvard historian Eric Baker recently wrote in the New York Times, American business culture equates incessant work with entrepreneurial success. Ironically, we moderns have made a virtue out of working 24/7. We wake up checking our messages and news feeds. We defer or interrupt our vacations, work late into the night, and on weekends. When God's people worked like this in ancient times, they didn't celebrate it. When they were forced to work unceasingly in Egypt, they called it slavery. And God set them free and granted them rhythms of rest that we're also meant to enjoy. Being wise means recognizing the gift of being finite creatures, not least by containing our compulsion for ceaseless work. Another aspect of being wise human leaders, rather than superheroes, is vulnerability. In the creation narrative, we are told that God created human beings to exercise power and responsibility, what Genesis calls dominion, on God's behalf. At the same time, God created human beings, quote, naked and not ashamed, unquote. Andy Crouch makes this wonderful observation that in God's design, vulnerability and dignity are not opposed to one another, and neither are dependence and dominion. As leaders, we want to appear powerful and invulnerable. Showing weakness risks others taking advantage. Showing weakness might undermine our credibility in the sight of those who are called to serve. And yet vulnerability is worth the risk. In my business after 9/11, our software company was faced with making some dramatic cuts. For some time, I was unsure how extensive those cuts would be. So I struggled with when and how to tell my team. I felt vulnerable given the uncertainties and the risk of losing my team's confidence in me as their leader. Ultimately, I opted to share with the team what we were facing despite the uncertainties and risks. I told them what I knew and what I didn't know. I asked two things of them. One, to stay focused on their work so we wouldn't make things worse. And two, to let me know if they had any intentions that would affect our staffing. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I was surprised by their positive responses. Several offered to reduce their work to part-time so others could stay. One person said they were planning on relocating. I suspect my willingness to be vulnerable with them gave them permission to be vulnerable with me. I have to admit that being vulnerable can occasionally bring out the worst of people. I've had that experience, and I suspect you have too. So we shouldn't do it naively. However, acknowledging our human vulnerability can also bring out the best in people. Even with the risks, isn't that what we as leaders should be doing? So in addition to learning to accept our limitations, learning to be vulnerable is a critical aspect of becoming a truly human leader. The last thing I want to say about shifting from a superhero model to a genuinely human model of leadership is that there are spiritual practices that can help along the way. I call them the practices of finitude. In other words, they remind you that God is God and you are not. Surprisingly, one of the spiritual practice is, wait for it, sleep. I know that sounds funny, right? That sounds funny, right? But it is, actually. I suspect most of us don't think of sleep as a discipline, much less a spiritual one. After all, sleep is a biological necessity, right? How can sleep be an intentional spiritual practice? The CDC suggests that 1 in 3 people in the U.S. is not getting enough sleep. Demands of modern life, overlaid with the expectations of our Christian convictions, set us up to view sleep as an annoyance to minimize as best as we can. We try to cram more and more into a 24-hour day, and that means we sleep less and less. In contrast, wisdom suggests that sleep is a gift from God. Our daily need to sleep is an opportunity to acknowledge our limits. We are reminded each night that we can't be, quote, like God after all. But we can, with the psalmist, learn to say, I lie down and sleep. I wake again because the Lord sustains me. Every night we are given the opportunity to experience sleep as an act of faith in God rather than in ourselves. Wherever we are with our projects and our to-do lists, we are invited to cast all our cares on Him, for He cares for you. It's a surprisingly simple yet difficult thing to do when deadlines and crises stare you in the face. That's why it's called a spiritual discipline. Being wise requires not only hard work and perseverance, but a willingness each day to stop our work and go to sleep as an act of faith. In other words, learning to be a wise leader requires a willingness to let go and allow God to be God. The final theme in becoming a wise leader is probably the most countercultural, moving from a solitary practice of leadership to one that sees leadership as a communal art. Some time ago, I had a good friend who was a CEO of a major U.S. corporation. He was widely known for his Christian faith and example, and I admired him as someone who embodied much of what I'd hoped to become as a leader. We spent a lot of time together talking about leadership practices. As we got to know each other more deeply, he became more vulnerable in sharing with me his leadership experience. One day he talked about what it was like to be a CEO. He said for him that it was a solitary, even lonely experience. Then with tears in his eyes, he said, and I know I made it that way. I understood what he meant. Our culture celebrates an individualistic, even heroic practice of leadership, especially in some Christian circles. I felt sad for my friend because of a sense of isolation and that he had internalized something that turns out to be the opposite of biblical wisdom. The good news is that leadership was never meant to be practiced as a solitary person. It was always meant to be practiced in community. And that means to become a wise leader, we must see leadership as a team sport rather than an individual one. As a result of my conversation with my friend, I've spent much of my life cultivating my leadership ecosystem. I've worked hard to build relationships in many and varied leadership contexts. Perhaps the most compelling argument for wisdom being found in such a diverse community is the day of Pentecost, and that's why this artwork is here for you. On that day, God's Spirit and wisdom were given to the whole community, and not just to a special group like the apostles or a privileged class. As the Apostle Peter acknowledged, God's Spirit is given to all, even those who are considered weak or of lesser value. The experience of the day of Pentecost echoes my earlier comments about paying attention to those on the periphery of our leadership vision. The Apostle Paul says this even more passionately and explicitly. On the contrary, the members of the body that seem weaker are indispensable. God has so arranged the body, giving the greater honor to the inferior member. Isn't that remarkable? To heed this biblical wisdom, we need to cultivate a community of diverse voices in our leadership circle. The truth is, it's easy to build teams and attract people who are similar to us, right? It's harder to attract people who are not. And it's harder still to create a hospitable space for those different from us to contribute meaningfully. In my board work, I've often found that women directors are less verbal than men in board conversations. So I asked one of my experienced female board colleagues to help me understand how I might create a more hospitable space. She shared her decades-long experience where male board members regularly talked over their female counterparts, making it difficult for them to get a word in edgewise. And she said many male directors affirmed their male counterparts, but not the female ones, even when they both made the same points. Her advice to me was simple. If you want my advice, ask me. And if you agree with me, say so. Well, duh, right? But her feedback helped change the way I conduct board meetings. I instituted a practice at the end of each meeting of going around the table, asking each person for their comments and questions. That's one way everyone has a chance to be heard, not just those of us who are alpha males. I also work at being more intentional about affirming my female board colleagues when they make a point that I agree with. This experience has taught me something more generally important, and that's this. Leaders have the responsibility not only to create space at the table for those who have been denied a seat in the past, but we have the responsibility to change the culture of the table, to make it more hospitable to others. Otherwise, we will miss out on all of the wisdom God has to offer in our work. As wise leaders, we need to learn how to intentionally change our leadership culture to make it hospitable to those who are different from us. So, given all that, how might you begin? Here are 3 next steps you can take in the week ahead, and I would encourage you to try one or more of them. First, make a list of the people who are on the periphery of your leadership vision. In other words, not those that you would normally focus on or spend time with. Pick one person from that list and connect with them. You don't have to have an agenda for the meeting. Just show up and let them know that you care about them and their work. Second, on the perhaps more the spiritual formation side in the vertical direction, each evening, take a few minutes to consciously let go of your work to God. Give thanks to God for your day. Acknowledge that God is God and you are not. That's the second. Third, find someone outside of your existing leadership circle. Sit down with them, maybe even today. This is a great place to do this, over coffee or lunch. Get to know them and see whether you'd like to continue in developing that relationship. Taking any one of those small steps will not only begin to shape your own leadership, it will positively affect your organization, your city, and the world. A world that's increasingly and desperately needs wise leaders who embody genuine hope and trustworthiness. Now, none of us can do that on our own. We can only do that as a faithful community of leaders who learn to trust God and one another. Your being here today is an opportunity to cultivate such an ecosystem of leaders in the city of Denver who are committed to doing business for the common good. So remember, God does not expect you to neglect your power as a servant leader. Instead, God wants you to embody power with humility in the service of the weak and the vulnerable. But remember, God does not expect you to be a superhero while you're doing it. Instead, God wants you to be a human leader with all the gifts and limitations that implies. And remember, God does not expect you to feel isolated and alone as a leader. Instead, God wants you to flourish as part of a diverse leadership community. As the Apostle Paul wrote to the early church, we are God's handiwork, not just you and me individually, but we together, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. May that be true for all of you who seek to be wise servants in this generation, for the glory of God and the common good of this great city of Denver. Amen.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Faith and Work podcast. We hope Uli Chi's keynote at Business for the Common Good this past year challenged and encouraged you to think differently about leadership. If you'd like to learn more about topics like this, visit us at denverinstitute.org. You'll find upcoming events, articles, and tools to help you live out your faith through your daily work. And also save the date, March 6, 2026, to join us in Denver celebrating our 10th annual Business for the Common Good. We hope that you'll make plans to be there. It's a great day. Some people even say it's like their homecoming. They get to see all the people they want to see in Denver, but also we have people coming in from all over the country as well. So we hope that you'll take an opportunity to do that. We'd love to welcome you to Denver and enjoy this day with us. If this episode resonated with you, we'd be grateful if you subscribe, leave a review, share it with a friend. And lastly, we're excited to share that select episodes are now available to watch on our Denver Institute YouTube channel. You can check us out at Denver Institute for Faith and Work. Until next time, may your work bring hope and life to your city.
If you've enjoyed this episode of the Faith and Work podcast, please subscribe, leave a review, or share it with a friend. The Faith and Work podcast is produced by Denver Institute. We believe that when Christians work faithfully, the world will taste the hope and life that Jesus provides. To learn more or to make a financial contribution, visit denverinstitute.org.